least you can do. But it's true that the issue of credit is not the most important ethical issue in life. And if this were just about credit, it wouldn't be very important. But there's something a lot more important at stake in your choice of what name to call the system. Your freedom is at stake. Indirectly, of course. Because directly, the name doesn't change anything. If you call a rose an onion, it'll still smell as sweet. But you might confuse a lot of cooks. So the name you choose does have an effect on other people. The words you choose determine the message you communicate to others. And that influences their thinking, which later guides their actions. If you call the system GNU, then you refer to the ideas associated with the name GNU. Since 27 years ago, the name GNU has been associated with the ideas of freedom and community that I've explained to you today. The name Linux is associated with different ideas, the ideas of Mr. Torvalds, a totally different outlook on life based on different values. What are his ideas? He doesn't believe that users of software deserve freedom. He doesn't even value his own freedom, because he says he's happy to use proprietary software as long as it works conveniently. So his values are powerful, reliable software, and nothing deeper than that. Well, he has a right to his views, but it's not right that the tremendous work we did for the sake of your freedom be misattributed to him and serve as his platform to reject the idea of freedom. But that's what he does. When people think that the system is Linux, they also think that the main developer of the system is Mr. Torvalds. And so they tend to pick up his ideas and his values, which means they don't learn to value their own freedom. And that means when we have to fight for freedom, they're not going to join in the fight, because they don't care if they have freedom or not. And that means we are fewer. And that means it's harder for us to win. We could all lose our freedom because they don't care. Because our future depends above all on what we value. Freedom is frequently threatened. To keep it, we have to defend it. That's true in all areas of life. Just look at the tremendous damage that Bush did to human rights all around the world. Damage which Obama is not very interested in correcting. But you don't have to look that far. I mean, you can see in India people being thrown off their land by corporations making mines or by dams. Freedom's threatened from a lot of different directions, and we have to defend it. But in other areas of life, the debate about human rights has gone on for decades or centuries, which is a long time to reach conclusions and spread them around the world. Now, that doesn't mean we necessarily succeed in defending human rights, but at least it gives us a base to try. But computing is a new area of life. Even in the most advanced countries, it's less than 20 years that most people have used computing. And in other countries, much less. Well, that's not a long time to have a debate about the question of what human rights a person deserves for using a program. Even if society had tried to have this debate. But most people never thought of that there was a question to ask, because almost everybody started using computers with proprietary software, surrounded by other users of proprietary software. That's all they knew. They didn't know there was any other possible way it could be. Leaving so soon? So, So they just took for granted that proprietary software was a legitimate possibility, was a legitimate way to do things. Which means that in effect, they let the proprietary developers dictate the answer to that question. What human rights do you deserve in using a program? And the answer they dictated was essentially none. We can control whatever we like. What other answer would they choose? They're greedy. They're corporations, which are psychopaths. So who's trying to start a debate about this? We in the free software movement believe we have identified 4 human rights that you deserve in using a program, namely the 4 freedoms that define free software. But when we try to bring these ideas to the attention of society and even the users of our system, GNU, we face 2 big obstacles. One is they don't know the system is GNU, and the other is they've never heard of free software. They don't know the system is GNU because somebody told them it's Linux. So when they see the articles from the GNU project that explain the philosophy of free software, they say to themselves, why should I read that? That's just about GNU, and I'm a Linux user. Why should I care about GNU? And the irony is, when they say I'm a Linux user, what they're really talking about is GNU, but they don't know that. So if they knew that, if they knew that they were GNU users using the GNU plus Linux system, then they might pay more attention to these articles. They might read them, and read them with a view to considering whether they agree. And then we'd have a chance to convince them. And so we would bring more people into demanding freedom for themselves. But today we have another obstacle, which is that the people who hear about our software don't hear that it's free software. Because they usually hear about it under another term, quote, open source, unquote. Why is that? Well, during the 90s, as the GNU/Linux system spread, it spread mostly among techies. So they saw, in addition to respecting their freedom, it was powerful, reliable, efficient, and they didn't have to pay for permission to run it. And they saw these were practical advantages. And most of these were people who focused on practical advantages, not on freedom. So they would recommend it to their friends for the practical advantages, but they wouldn't talk about freedom. So the use of the system spread faster than value and freedom did. And so there were 2 camps within the free software community. There was the camp, the free software movement, those of us who thought about freedom and demanded freedom. And there was the other camp, the people who appreciated the same software, but only for practical convenience reasons. And then in 1998, that second camp coined and adopted the term open source, which had never been used before. And because it was a new term, they were able to choose which ideas to associate with it and which ideas to forget. And they chose to forget the ethical level of the issue. Whereas we say software is ethically distributed if it respects your freedom, and the software that's proprietary is mistreating you, reject it. They don't want to criticize proprietary software on ethical grounds at all. So they only talk about what's more convenient. They say that they recommend the development methodology, and the reason they recommend it is that it usually produces more powerful, reliable software. Well, I think that if that's true, it's a nice bonus, but it's not what really matters, because freedom is what really matters. If a program is not powerful and reliable, but it respects my freedom, I might be disappointed with it, but I can still use it. And of course, I'm always free to improve it if I care enough. If it really bothers me, well then why don't I spend some time making it better? I could, after all, because I'm free to do that. But with a proprietary program, there's nothing I can do to make it free. It has a fatal flaw that I can't do anything to correct. So, in 1998, those people started talking about open source. But there were already a number of companies in the free software community. They distributed and even developed free software. But most of them were also involved with proprietary software. And they didn't want to teach the community to demand freedom, because people who learned to demand freedom would no longer be possible customers for proprietary products. So these companies chose to use the term open source. And as usual, the politicians and journalists followed the companies. And since then, those of us who talk about free software have been a minority in the community we founded. But we're still here. We're not going to stop talking about freedom just because other people don't do it, because we still want freedom for us and for you. But we have to ask for your help, because a lot of users hear about open source, and the only ideas they hear are the ideas of the open source camp. And they have no idea that our community and our system came out of a totally different idea which says this is an ethical issue. There are a lot of articles that talk about my work and call it open source, and the only ideas they mention are the ones based on the values I don't share. I've seen articles that call me the father of open source. So I wrote letters to the editor saying, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived through artificial insemination. Using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. Of course, the reason I started with that joke was so that they would publish the rest of the letter, which would explain the difference, the ideas of free software, as I did today, and how it's different from open source. That's the point. I want people to see that the free software movement's ideas exist. I don't want them to see only the open source ideas. Now, I'm not saying that people who say they support open source are bad. Usually the software they develop is free, so usually it's a contribution to our community. Usually the work they're doing is good, useful work. But it's not enough just to develop software that's free and make it available to people. It's good, but it's not enough. Because if we just give people freedom and we don't teach them what it is, they'll lose it. They'll just drop it because they're not paying attention. So if we want to establish freedom in a lasting way, we have to do more than just give people freedom. We have to teach people to value freedom. And that's the part that open source doesn't try to do. It chooses not to address that point. So we in the free software movement are the ones who have to take care of it. And that's why I ask for your help. You can help by bringing up these ideas when they're relevant. If you see people making a decision about what to do in terms of using or developing software, and if you see that they're trying to decide based purely on convenience, disregarding the ethics of freedom, well, then you have been elected by circumstances to bring up the issues of freedom that need to be discussed. That's your duty. You can do it. And meanwhile, you can help us all the time just by saying free / libre / swatantra software instead of saying open source. Because it's your choice which philosophical camp to support. When you say free software, you support ours. And when you say open source, you support the other one. Well, you're free to promote your views. If you agree with us about freedom, please show people our name. And you could also help us by calling the system GNU/Linux so that you give us equal mention instead of giving credit only to Mr. Torvalds. These things are important because nowadays we have to struggle for freedom. In the old days, it was just a matter of a lot of code that had to be written. Well, there's still more code we'd like to write, even though now we have a lot. But there are other kinds of obstacles that are not so easy to overcome. For instance, there are many I/O devices that whose interface specs are secret. The manufacturer will sell you the product and they refuse to tell you how to use it. So maybe it only runs with Windows. Or maybe it does run with GNU/Linux, but it needs a non-free driver, which of course is just as unethical as Windows. It's just as freedom-denying as any other non-free program. So what can we do? There are only two things we can do about this problem. One is boycott the product, or just reject it. After all, if something's harmful to you and you reject it, that's not really a boycott, that's just recognizing your interests. If your interest is in freedom, then you can't use that product. But the other thing, and of course we need a lot of people doing that before they notice. But the other thing we can do is reverse engineering. And that's very important work. It would be quite useful for an IIT to set up a reverse engineering of devices lab and start figuring out how to make free drivers for some of these devices. That would be a wonderful contribution to the community. But we can see the effects of the fact that awareness of freedom is weak in our community in the ways we have lost our freedom within the community itself. I'll give you two examples out of several. In 1992, when Linux was liberated, we had the GNU plus Linux system. You could install it in a PC and use it in freedom. Not easily, though. You had to be a real wizard to do that at the beginning. So people worked on various distributions of GNU/Linux to make it easier to install. So a few years later, there were several distributions in competition. So the developers of a distribution had the idea, we could gain over the other distributions if we put in some non-free programs and present them as a bonus, an advantage of our distribution. So they did that, and it worked because most of the users were not thinking about freedom. So they liked this advantage of these non-free programs. So the developers of other distributions looked at that and said, uh-oh, they're gaining because they have those non-free programs. We have to put in non-free programs also so that they don't have an advantage. So all the distributions did that. 10 years ago, there were more than 100 distributions of GNU/Linux, I think, but none of them was free. All of them contained non-free programs. Some contained a little, some contained a lot, but they all had some. So when people ask me, where can I get this system, I have to say, there's no place I can recommend to you because all the distros have non-free software. So we had reached freedom and fallen back because we didn't appreciate freedom enough as a community. Well, I'm happy to say that now there are some completely free GNU/Linux distros. For instance, there is Ututo, U-T-U-T-O. It's named after a lizard. And then there is BLAG, which stands for BLAG, Linux, and GNU. And there is GNUsense, which is another joke. You see, it's spelled G-New-Sense. But my title as the head of the GNU project is the Chief Nuisance, spelled differently. So, and then there is Triskel, and there are various others. You can find a list of them in GNU.org/distros. But I'm sure you've noticed that these are not the well-known distributions. The well-known distros continue to contain or recommend non-free software, and therefore we have begun to recover the freedom we abandoned, but just begun. We have a long way to go to reach the point where we can assume that anyone installing GNU/Linux is only installing free software. But that's just one way. It turns out that today Linux is not entirely free software. Linux, the kernel. It contains pieces which are not free. These are called binary blobs. These are firmware programs to be installed into various I/O devices. And they are present in supposed source files, but they are not source code. They look like long tables of numbers, up to 300,000 numbers in a table. And those numbers are actually an executable program whose source code is not available. So, if it's not source code, it's not free software. In addition, many of these blobs explicitly carry a non-free license. So today, we have to maintain a free version of Linux, the kernel. It's called Linux Libre, or Free Linux. And what we do is we delete the blobs, and thus we make a version which is only free software, but it doesn't work with certain I/O devices. Well, we have no choice if we want freedom. And the symbol of Linux Libre is a penguin who's washing himself and cleaning himself with a brush. So it's really easy to lose your freedom if you're not paying attention to it. And today there's another way to lose control of your computing, and that is software as a service. Software as a service means that you do your computing by sending all the relevant data to a server that's controlled by someone else, where it does your computing and sends you back the results. Or maybe it takes action for you based on those results. And you lose control because you don't control how the server does things. So, using software as a service is basically equivalent to running a proprietary program, except it would be even harder for you to figure out what it's doing or change it. You see, with a proprietary program, you typically get an executable but no source code. And to figure out what the executable is doing is really hard, and changing it's even harder. But with software as a service, you don't get the source code and you don't get the executable, because the executable is only in the server where you have no access to it. So it is absolutely theoretically impossible for you to figure out what it's doing, and absolutely impossible for you to change it. Not only that, but some proprietary programs have the malicious feature of spyware, where it has special code to send data about the use of the machine to somebody else's server. Well, with software as a service, you have to send the data to that server just in order to use it. So, without any special code, it produces the same effect. But it's even worse. Some proprietary programs, like Windows, have a backdoor that lets somebody forcibly change the software that's being used. Well, with software as a service, the server operator can always change the software running on the server. You wouldn't even know. So it's the same effect as having that backdoor, except no special code is required to do it. So software as a service is equivalent to a proprietary program with spyware and a backdoor. So if you want freedom, you just can't use software as a service. You mustn't. Now, software as a service is a special case of web services. Most web services are not software as a service because they're not doing your own computing on data you provide. They're doing something else. Something you couldn't possibly have done on your own data in your own computer, like communicating with other people. Well, those are different issues. And those servers do raise various ethical issues that we've heard about. I'm pointing out one more ethical issue that some web services raise. Of course, there are other issues like if you give some of your data to a web server, what is it going to do with your data? Those are real issues too, but people already know about them. This one I have to call attention to. To close, I'd like to treat a couple of other specific topics. One is free software and employment. People who don't like free software try to scare us that if the world moves to free software, we'll lose disastrously employment in the IT sector. That's just fun. If this is the IT sector, paid programming work is a small fraction of the IT sector employment. Most of it is using software, and free software only helps that. But let's look at the paid programming. A small fraction of that is developing proprietary software, but most of it is developing custom software, where there's a particular client that's paying for a certain program to be written. Well, custom software business is not going to change much if the users demand freedom, because the same clients are still going to have to pay for writing the same programs. You see, lots of people develop free software as volunteers. Most free software developers are volunteers. But volunteers write what they want to write. They write what's interesting to them or what they think is really needed. They don't spend their time writing a big program for a particular company. And if a company says to a volunteer, well, we'd write really like this, and this, would you please write those things for us? The volunteer would say, well, I could, but that's not what I'm interested in, so I'll only do that if you pay me. And so basically the client's going to have to pay just the same. And this business is going to be there just the same, more or less the same, details change. So the worst possible case is we lose this small fraction of the IT sector employment, which is a pretty small loss and nothing to worry about. But that's just the worst possible case. We might gain employment. You see, free software generates employment too. Employment adapting and extending free programs to new uses. That's not even possible to do with proprietary software. If somebody wanted to pay you to extend Windows or change Windows to work better for him, he can't do it and you can't do it. But if he wants to pay you to change GNU/Linux, that's really a possibility, and people do that. So we lose a little and we gain some. Maybe it's a net gain, or maybe it's a small net loss. I'm no economist, I can't try to predict, but the crucial point is there's nothing to be afraid of. Then there's free software in education. Schools, all schools, and the whole educational system must teach exclusively free software. There are 4 reasons for this. The most superficial and obvious reason is the possibility of saving money. You see, with free software, the school system is free to redistribute copies to all the schools. And the schools are then free to install copies in as many computers as they like, and they don't have to pay anyone to have permission to do this, which means that they can save money. Now, even in the wealthiest countries, the schools don't have enough money, so this is important. But it's also superficial, and it doesn't get at the deep issue of free software. So we should not make the mistake of focusing mainly on cost savings. We shouldn't talk about that without talking about freedom as well. And besides, there are some proprietary software companies that eliminate the possibility of savings because they donate gratis copies of their non-free software to schools, and sometimes even students, or almost gratis. And why do they do this? It's because they're trying to use the schools as an instrument to impose on society as a whole a permanent dependence on their products. Here's how their plan works. They deliver the gratis copies to the school, and the school teaches the students to use them, and the students develop a dependence. And then they graduate. And after they graduate, the same developer does not offer them gratis copies. And they go to work for companies. The developer does not offer those companies gratis copies. So the plan is the school will direct those students down the path of dependence, and they can pull the rest of society along with them if we let that happen. It's the same idea as donating gratis needles full of addictive drugs to the school, saying, inject these into your students. The first dose is gratis. Once you're dependent, then you have to pay. And sometimes people say, well, let's give the schools both GNU/Linux and Windows, and that way the students can get to know them both. That's like saying, let's serve both water and whiskey in the school lunch. Let's give the students some spinach and some tobacco. No, that's not right. You see, the school has a social mission to educate good citizens of a strong, capable, cooperating, independent, and free society. And in computing, that means teaching the students to be free software users. Teaching proprietary software goes against the mission of the school. But there's a deeper reason for the education of the best programmers. You see, some people are natural-born programmers. At the age of 10 to 13, they're fascinated by the computer, and they want to learn how everything works. So if a youth is using a program, she's likely to ask, how does this program do this? If it's proprietary, the teacher can only say, I'm sorry, it's a secret, we can't find out. So education is not allowed. Proprietary software is knowledge withheld. It's the enemy of the spirit of education. It must not be allowed in a school. But if it's free software, the teacher can explain as much as he knows and then say, here's a copy of the source code. Read it and you'll understand everything. And our youth, who yearns to understand, will read it. And the teacher can say, if you come across any point you can't figure out, show me and we'll figure it out together. This gives our natural-born programmer the chance to learn a very important lesson. That code is not clear. You shouldn't write it that way. If even a natural-born programmer can't figure out, it must be really unclear. You see, natural-born programmers are so clever at writing code that they can see all sorts of obscure, hard-to-understand ways of making something work. They need to learn you shouldn't do that. How do you learn to write good, clear code? By reading lots of code and writing lots of code. Only free software gives you the opportunity to read lots of code of real programs, real large programs that we really use. And how do you start writing lots of code? How do you learn to write code for large programs? You have to start small. But that doesn't mean small programs. You see, small programs don't even introduce you to the difficulties of large programs. So starting small has to mean small changes in existing large programs. That way you can do a small thing, but you're tackling the difficulties of a large program. Well, only free software offers you the possibility to change the code of a real existing large program that we really use. This is how I learned. When the Artificial Intelligence Lab hired me as a system hacker, which means my job was to improve the operating system, well, That meant I would read part of a large program and implement a change, and then I would fix the bugs, and then I'd read part of another large program and write another change and fix the bugs. And I did this hundreds of times. Sometimes the users asked for something, sometimes I just had the idea myself. But I did this over and over, and I learned how to do it well. Today, well, that was an opportunity that was almost unique. But today, any school can offer this opportunity, but only if it's a free software school. But there's an even deeper reason. For the sake of moral education, education in citizenship, schools must teach not just facts and skills, but also the spirit of goodwill, the habit of helping others. So every class should have this rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share copies with the rest of the class, including the source code in case somebody wants to learn. Because this class is a place for sharing our knowledge. But the school, in order to set a good example, has to follow its own rule. The school must bring only free software to class. This university must bring only free software to class. This school, like every school, has a duty to move to free software, to stop teaching anyone to use non-free software, because that's the opposite of its purpose. So those of you who are connected with this school or any school, it's your responsibility to campaign and pressure for the school to stop dealing with proprietary software. Look for allies, organize, and always raise it as an ethical issue. Don't let the discussion get sidetracked into purely or primarily considering convenience and ignoring things that are more important. So, to close, I will present before the auction that I hope they will let me have, I will present my other identity. Of the Church of Emacs. Computer, my child. Emacs started out as an extensible text editor that was extended so much it became a way of life for many users because they could do all their computing inside Emacs. And then it became a church with the launch of the news group alt.religion.emacs that you might be amused to visit. Today, in the Church of Emacs, we have a great schism between several rival versions of Emacs. And we also have saints, but no gods. Instead of gods, we adore the one true editor. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must recite the Confession of the Faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. Then if you become a real wizard, you can celebrate that with our ceremony, the Fubar Mitzvah, in which you chant lines from our sacred text, the system source code. We also have the cult of the Virgin of Emacs. The Virgin of Emacs is anyone who has not yet used Emacs. And according to the Church of Emacs, offering the virgin the opportunity to lose Emacs virginity is a blessed act. We also have the Emacs pilgrimage, which consists of invoking all the commands of Emacs in alphabetical order. No one knows what the result of that would be, or how long it would take. The Church of Emacs has certain advantages compared with other churches I will mention today. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. But it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise whatever evil proprietary operating systems have possessed computers under your control or set up for your regular use, and then install a wholly free operating system. And then only use and install free software with and on the system. If you make this vow and you live by it, then you too will have the right to wear a halo, if you can find one. Sometimes people have asked whether it is a sin, according to the Church of Emacs, to use the other editor VI. It's true that VI is the editor of the beast. But using a free implementation of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. And some have asked whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. So, thank you very much.